So, yesterday we talked about India and Africa. Hopefully, you had a chance to look at all those documents and put them into Canvas there. Clicking on Start Assignment, and you can put those into the text box. But today in the notes, we'll look at the remaining topics: Germany, Russia, South Africa, Asia, and the impact of imperialism. So, first, let's look at Germany. Germany is a relatively new country, and Bismarck didn't really have a lot of interest in imperialism. He wanted to concentrate it on consolidating his power at home. Nevertheless, though, Germany did establish protectorates in Africa, smaller, of course, than the other countries. But there weren't a lot of Germans that were interested in resettling, and their colonies didn't really return any type of economic benefit. However, the Germans, on a couple of occasions, would be involved in some more horrific incidents, believe it or not, such as in 1904, native people to Southwest Africa that they participated in herding into camps and then eventually attempting to eliminate. And that ends our discussion about German imperialism because that was pretty much it. South Africa was a different type of story because it involved both British and Dutch settlers. The Dutch settlers were known as, well, two different names: Boers, which is spelled Boers, and they're also known as Afrikaners, which is spelled Afrikaners. The British and the people of Dutch descent ended up actually fighting for control. The British ended up winning control of South Africa, but allowed the Boers to have a privileged place in society. Eventually, a system was developed of segregation, except there it was known as apartheid. Even though blacks made up a supermajority of the population, they were relegated to second place citizenship, not allowed to participate in government, having to carry around ID papers all the time, getting in criminal trouble if they didn't have a job, and lots of other restrictions that people that were white did not face. And the reason why South Africa was such a prize was because of the trading position, obviously, on the tip of Africa, but also some of the mineral resources, like diamonds, for instance. So Russia will be a little bit different of a place, and it will come back to bite Europe later on, because obviously segregation is going to fall out of favor in the United States by the 60s and 70s, and then eventually the world turns its eyes towards South Africa, and they're eventually pressured to give up their system. Russia, in the meantime, its imperialism involved continually gobbling up as much land in the northern part of Asia and Europe, west of the Urals. So they wanted to consolidate control around the Baltic Sea. And they started to become less and less tolerant toward nomadic peoples that lived within the Russian Empire. They would expand into the Caucasus and then also the flatter areas of Central Asia, and eventually they would get involved in the Middle East. And of course, one of the big differences would be in some of those territories, like the Caucasus or the steppes and plains of Central Africa, you would not have Orthodox Christians, but Muslims. And so that created some conflict between the two groups as well. And then speaking of the Middle East and Asia, that would be one of the other areas that Europe will get involved with. We already talked about India. France will have colonies in what they call Indochina, which today is made up of Vietnam and neighboring countries. A lot of people forget that the Vietnam War was originally because of the French. Vietnam wanted independence. France wanted them to remain as a colony. And they also had colonies in Indonesia. And these were all for the same reasons that Britain wanted to keep their colonies in the Caribbean, in the Western Hemisphere, because of the tropical climates and the type of crops that could be grown. But Europe had a competitor, the United States, became more and more involved in Asia. Matthew Perry, of course, tried opening up trade with Japan in 1853. I don't know if you could quite say that he was successful with that, but it did inspire the Japanese to modernize, eventually making them a competitor with neighboring Russia. And of course, they would purchase Alaska in 1867 from Russia. At the time, it was thought of as a joke purchase because a lot of people didn't see any relevance in purchasing this large, what people thought worthless piece of land. Of course, that would quickly change after the finding of gold and then eventually oil. And then, of course, the United States engaged in the Spanish-American War. Spain, for quite some time, since the Spanish Armada had been something of a second-place country in Europe, especially considering the other Western countries were doing quite well and expanding, prospering, industrializing. But Spain kind of was relegated to the same place they had always been. So, in other words, the Spanish-American War was not really much of a challenge for the United States. And Spain ended up losing some of their remaining colonies and territories, including the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba, amongst others. And then there was China. China was also a place the United States and European countries were interested in opening up trade. After all, there are lots of customers there, and there's also plenty of resources. The Qing dynasty, which is spelled Qing, had kind of fallen into disrepair. They didn't have the ability to keep control over such a large country anymore, nor did they have the ability to put off any type of influence from the West. And so basically they looked weak and pathetic, especially to the people of China. Europe and the United States ended up engaging in what was known as an open door policy, which basically meant we can do whatever we want inside China. But it also meant selling things that we mentioned before, like opiates and other types of goods that Chinese people looked at as eroding their culture. And so eventually there was a rebellion in 1899 to 1901, the Boxer Rebellion. But that's one of the things that the Europeans and the Americans could all agree on, is the rebellion was not good for business. And so they all gladly sent in some amount of troops in order to squash the rebellion. And the British, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, the United States would all have colonies sprinkled throughout Asia, especially in the East Indies in particular. And that would continue in some cases up through and including World War II, which is another reason why not just the United States was concerned about Japan's dominance during that war. And some of the impact of imperialism was the fact that it would encourage more economic growth, continue to increase the number of new crops and other types of resources, and then, of course, the types of technologies that were invented sometimes inadvertently would help out with imperialism, and of course, that depends upon which side you were on, such as a Maxim gun, invented by Hiram Maxim, which would eventually become the precursor to the modern machine gun, would be used, of course, to mow down any types of rebellion that occurred throughout the colonies of an empire. But some other things that helped out imperialism were, of course, steamboats. Africa still doesn't have lots of highways, but what they do have are rivers, and of course, steamboats can be used to traverse the territory by water. There's also the problem with tropical disease, and as Europe made medical advancements, they discovered more and more things that would help them explore without succumbing to the tropical types of ailments that they weren't used to. Quinine, for instance, would be used as a cure for malaria, which had been a constant problem for Europeans exploring Africa and parts of southern Asia. And then, of course, the telegraph system would also allow lots of communications to take place throughout the world almost instantaneously, including to the coast of Africa, Latin America, and around southern Asia. And one of the other influences, of course, was the attempt to spread Christianity. Both Protestant and Catholic missionaries would attempt to travel to different parts of the empires in order to spread the word. This is actually one area where women could be actively involved with in ministering or teaching or providing services through the missionary work. But of course, some missionaries were incredibly sympathetic toward native peoples, especially if they could get them to convert. And so missionaries and the bureaucrats, the government workers for the empires, didn't always get along. Because especially once these people converted, then the missionaries wanted to protect them. And they knew that some of the economic development was taking advantage of local people. Sometimes the people had more harsh punishments, for instance, using the mother country's justice system, which was unfair toward natives. And so missionaries and the government officials of the British Empire, the French Empire, what have you, didn't always get along. And so missionaries actually ended up sticking up for natives. Now, that's not 100% of the time, obviously, especially if people weren't converting. And they're just like any other occupation, there are missionaries that were corrupt and taking advantage as well. And then, of course, the benefits of science from imperialism. Botany and zoology ended up being exposed to many different types of animals and plants, respectively. Many of them will be brought back, for instance, for botanical gardens. Medicine, by looking at some of the new types of plants they would discover, would be expanded upon. And the cures for tropical diseases would also help out with medicine at home in Europe. And anthropology, the study of cultures of human beings, would start to expand as a social science as Europe came in contact with more and more types of people. And then, of course, bringing plants and animals home was not the only thing that happened. And so were people sometimes. And sometimes they were used as forms of entertainment. There's something that happened every few years was a World's Fair exhibition. And in some cases, native peoples were brought back to use as displays, basically encouraged to reinforce stereotypical behavior that maybe they didn't even want to in the first place or wasn't actually that common. But of course, Europeans wanted to see native peoples act the way they thought they did. And of course, none of this would last forever. Obviously, by the end of World War I, some of the weaker countries, especially those that lost, were less able to keep hold of their colonies. And that would definitely come true by the end of World War II. Britain was no longer able to hold on. France would attempt to for a little bit longer, so would a couple other countries, but inevitably decolonization will occur. But we'll talk more about that later.